So why did we come here? Why do we do this practice? Well, one way to think about it, among many possibilities, is that we came here in order to touch the heart, both metaphorically and literally. So we know what it means to have one's heart touched metaphorically. It means to access a place of unconditional love, to love deeply. That's how I would think about the heart that we're trying to touch when we do this practice, when we come to a retreat. So that's sort of on the emotional side. However, this is not the superficial meaning of touching the heart. Not that there's anything wrong with the superficial meaning, but the kind of touching of the heart that I'm thinking of, that would be the purpose for this practice, is to love deeply. That would be my phrase. And I would say that the ability to love deeply is related to the second touching of the heart, which I said is a literally touching of the heart. So you might think, oh, literally, then you mean touch the physical heart. No, I mean touch the heart of the matter. The heart of the matter. And the heart of the matter, from the viewpoint of human experience, is, well, what is human experience? What is the essence of our experience at the deepest level? Whenever I go to Canada, one of the things that I look forward to there is the fact that you can get really good Indian food, specifically South Indian food. If you're familiar with what's called the Udupi cuisine, South Indian vegetarian. Can't get it very good in the US, but in Mississauga, near the airport, in the Toronto area, you can get this really, really great Indian cuisine. And the other great cuisine that I can get in Toronto that I don't get in Burlington or Tucson, for that matter, is Hong Kong style dim sum. And whenever I go to the dim sum restaurant, it always has a kind of association for me because of the two Chinese characters that in Cantonese are pronounced dim sum. In Mandarin it's dian xin. So we like to represent the heart this way. You see it everywhere. And the Chinese character for heart is actually fairly similar looking. Not a coincidence, obviously. You can even get the aorta a little bit, maybe, and so forth. So originally it was definitely a picture of a heart that looked a lot like this. So what's interesting is the phrase dian xin, or dim sum. If you're interested, you can look on Wikipedia and you'll see the same history I'm about to tell you. So, Deanne, could mean to warm, sort of warm your heart. So that's a snack. But also it can mean to touch or to contact something. If you spot it, you touch it, you have a contact. And so for me, I always think of those two sides to the practice. The touching of the heart at the deepest level. This Chinese character sum, or Shin, it means the physical heart, but it also means consciousness, consciousness itself. In some languages, consciousness is a word separate from the word that means heart. For example, consciousness in Greek is nous, but the word for heart is, you know it, cardiology, right? What is it, cardion, I guess, in Greek. It's different words. But it turns out that in Chinese, the word that means, and also Japanese, same kanji, the word that means the physical heart also means consciousness. Sometimes you see it translated as mind, M-I-N-D, but that can be very tricky. Mind can mean mental experience, meaning thought. And sometimes this character can mean that. But more broadly, particularly within the context of contemplative practice, it means consciousness. In other words, what I would call sensory experience. So, what is it to directly touch sensory experience? Well, it's to be in the moment, right, with sensory experience. So that is literally to touch the heart of the matter in the sense of, well, every inner or outer heaven or hell that anybody is ever going to experience involves experience. It involves sensory experience. So if we know something that is universal to all moments of consciousness, if we know something about consciousness that is universal and deep and helpful, well, then we could say that we have touched the heart of the matter as far as our own personal happiness goes. But there's also the warming of the heart, the contacting of the emotional self in a way that one is drawn to service and touching the emotional self in a way that one is able to deeply love, and based on that, able to effectively act in the world. I would say that there is a very close relationship between these two forms of touching the heart. And spiritual grown-upness, spiritual maturity, well, there's many metrics, many ways that we might measure it, but one way would be the degree to which a person understands the relationship between these two endeavors of touching the heart. They're very closely related, Because when you touch the heart in the sense of contact the nature of consciousness, which is just another way to say contact the nature of see, hear, feel, of sensory experience, that connects you directly to the consciousness of all other beings. Not as a concept, not as a wishful thinking belief, but as a inescapable moment by moment reality as you move through the world. That fundamental alienation, the fundamental separation of inside and outside, that rock solid concept that says my identity ends with my skin. Outside the skin is out. Everything inside this skin and inside this head is in, and that's me. And there is a kind of a brick wall that separates these two worlds and leads to fundamental alienation. When you touch the deepest part of, or when a person, you, me, anyone, touches directly the senses, you discover that there's a commonality. All sensory experience at the deepest level has the same taste, eka rasa, the one taste. And that one taste is universal. You are directly then connected to everyone else's consciousness, and from that comes quite naturally and easily a sense of loving towards each thing that manifests in front of you, if it's a physical object or it's another person. It could be a saint, it could be a sinner, it could be a beautiful flower or a smelly garbage can. Though on the surface of consciousness, though they're all quite different. But at the instant of perception, what might be called the now in the absolute sense, and remember, any duration is just a bunch of nows. So there actually aren't any durations. There's only the nows. And when you are in the absolute now, you can be aware of surface distinctions, but they're all pervaded by a deep unification. And that unification not only unifies mind and body, not only unifies sense and nonsense, not only unifies pleasure and pain, but also unifies inside and outside. And ultimately unifies the surface with the source, you might say. True non-dual awareness. So as one goes about ordinary activities during the day, one sees, hears, feels the sight, sound, touch of the world. One sees, hears, and feels the image, talk, body, emotion of the psyche. But they all sort of have, not sort of, they all have the same taste. And that is, and therefore, each of those experiences comes from and returns to the same place. And that place has been given many names confusingly over the years and across the cultures of the world. Some people call it the true self. Some people call it no self. Some people call it emptiness. Some people call it the source. In the Tang Dynasty in China, they started to call it Shinzen. It means the nature of consciousness, the nature of experience. It's that same character there. So as one sees, hears, feels the world, and as one thinks and has emotions about the world, if you are in that moment fully, in the absolute now, then it will seem that all of the surface distinctions arise from and return to, moment by moment, a single unification. And that was also sometimes referred to at that same period as the Buddha nature. There's the very famous story that I've commented on many times. Does the 狗子有佛性有无? Does a dog have the Buddha nature? Yes or no? It's a very famous story. You can answer yes, you can answer no, you can answer both, yes and no, or you can answer neither yes nor no. I will accept all of those answers as long as you deeply understand what each one of them refers to. Okay, so if moment by moment we're touching the primordial perfection, the sound of sound just before you consciously hear sound, the sensation in your body just before you consciously experience that sensation, the primordial stirring that precedes the arising of mental talk, the vibrant matrix from which that arises. When we touch that, moment by moment during the day, in our ordinary goings and comings, we connect. The fundamental separation between inside and outside goes away. So that the first thing that one sees or hears or feels, the very first thing, the actual sparsha, the actual touch, the actual contact with the now of the senses, that very first taste is a taste of connection. We can call that touching the heart literally, if we use heart in the Chinese sense of the word. The very next thing after that is a spontaneous, natural sense of love for what had hitherto, earlier in your life, been looked upon as the other. That's the next instant. And then what is the next instant after that? The next instant after that is whatever. Maybe it's a judgment. Maybe it's a plan. Maybe it's nothing in particular. You just move on to the next thing. It's what would have been there if you hadn't meditated. But because you did meditate and you stayed with it until it took you to the deep end of the pond, now, before all that ordinary stuff that still does occur, just like it did before, preceding your judgment or your plan or your association or your ignoring and moving on, because it has been preceded by touching the heart literally, and then the warming of the heart, the deep love that comes from inescapable connection, because all the ordinary stuff is always preceded by what I just said. The actions that we take in the world become more effective. So we have that ability to love deeply and act effectively. And it's optimized, it's potentiated, it's empowered by this direct contact. Direct contact is exactly the same as the now, the absolute now. So some of you know that a common definition of mindfulness is, due to John Kabat-Zinn, is present-centered, non-judgmental awareness, or something like that. But actually, you could just leave, if you wanted to really simplify things, you could leave off the non-judgmental. It's redundant. Do you understand what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. It's redundant to present-centered. So most people, if you say present-centered or I'm present or something like that, they can only associate it with what they've experienced. So the what one is likely to think is, oh, present-centered must mean I'm not thinking about the past, or I'm not lost in my thoughts. That's what it means to be present-centered. Or when I eat, I know I'm eating. When I walk, I know I'm walking. So that kind of present-centered is a good thing, and in fact, that's pretty much where we start. I would call that being relatively in the present moment. And as I say, you got to start somewhere, so that's relatively in the present moment is where you start. Hopefully that will mature to being absolutely in the present moment. That's a very, very different critter. You can be thinking about anything. You can be thinking about the past or the future, but you're instant by instant so in contact with the image or the talk and so forth that there's no time to fixate time and space. You don't fixate a duration. You don't have the notion, I've been thinking for the last 3 minutes. To have that notion, you have to have been fixating the overall. If you're just at the razor's edge of the present, well, that razor's edge cuts both ways. So there can't be any extension through time. Likewise, if there's no time, then there's no time for it to spread in space. And so when you're in the absolute now, you're at the source of time and the experience of time and space. But your experience is not embedded in time and space. So that's another way to think about the endeavor. It's when you touch the heart, when you touch consciousness directly, you have an experience that is, in a sense, outside of the time-space continuum. Sometimes that's described as abiding in the unborn. It's an interesting way to think about things. Okay, so what I've said so far may sound a little bit abstract. Can I make it more tangible? Sure. However, I would hasten to mention that just like the metaphor of the blind man and the elephant, there are many, many, many valid alternative descriptions of what it is like to be in the absolute now, or touching the heart of the matter. Many valid descriptions. There's one particular one that I like, and it's just one that I like for a variety of reasons. I'm used to it. I like it because it seems to have some relationship to certain things that come up in math and science and so forth. And that is the paradigm of expansion and contraction. So, if I were to put it into words, if I were to try to describe my own experience, I would say that one in the beginning of practice has to struggle to just keep track of what's going on. As you get some skill, you're able to keep track of what's going on. And more and more, you become aware that things arise and then they pass. Let's say you have an experience of pain. Your leg didn't hurt, and then it starts to hurt, and then it hurts, and then the bell rings. That's where you start. But then as you deepen, you'll notice, well, it's not quite just it started and then it lasted and then it stopped. There's like a little bit of waviness on it, a little bit of fluctuation. So the first view is it starts, it lasts for a while. Let's see which side it goes from here, right? It starts, it lasts for a while, then it stops. But then as you pay a little more attention, you'll see it starts, and maybe there's a little bit of fluctuation there. It's not absolutely the same. And then you start to ask yourself, well, what's the source of that ripple? It's not really very intense. You wouldn't notice it until you start to really pay attention. Well, the reason there's a subtle ripple on the surface, and ripple doesn't mean it's necessarily regular, but there's some fluctuation. It gets a little stronger, it gets a little weaker. If nothing else, when you get distracted, it diminishes a little bit, and then when you come back to it, it sort of intensifies. But as you start to fathom whence the ripple, you'll see that actually underlying that seeming duration of unchangingness, underlying it is a sequence of arising, passing, arising, passing, arising, passing. So some of you know what, most of you, I guess, are familiar with the concept of a fractal. So now, okay, we have arising, passing, arising, passing, arising, passing. But now, look at an arising. Let's look at a single arising under the microscope. Well, turns out there's a lot of little arisings and passings modulated on that. And each one of those comes from and returns. Comes from and returns, comes from and returns. So, if you selectively attend to just the arising phase, at some point, all of the arisings become a single continuous spread of space. Because before a surface see, hear, feel arises, before it arises as an opaque, objectified something, deep down there has to be a stirring of pre-conscious processing that sort of creates a space. And if you notice that space beginning to be created, and you just stay with that, you are now in the absolute now. And there is only the spread of the space itself, while at the exact same time, whatever arises on the surface has no time to coagulate, and so all of the passings merge into a single simultaneous effortless collapse of the time-space continuum. So in the end, the reason something wells up is that it is simultaneously spreading and collapsing. In its beginning is its end. In my beginning is my end. That's a line from T.S. Eliot. No sooner is it arising, but it's already passing. And if all of the arisings, if you're absolutely in the present moment, all of the arisings become a single spread of space. And all of the passings become a single collapse of space. And it's like a fountain that's simultaneously gushing and gathering. We might refer to that as absolute activity. An activity that is so continuous that it never turns into a noun. It just stays as a verb. By way of contrast, sometimes there's no arisings or passings. Or put another way, sometimes something passes and nothing replaces it for a period of time. And by a period of time, I mean the clock on the wall is moving, but the clock inside is not moving. So yes, it's a period of time. You could say 3 seconds or 3 minutes or 3 hours, whatever it is. Something passed and nothing replaced it. Or another way to put it that might sound a little more feasible is the tug of the senses goes away. There's no pull to inner or outer worlds. So if there's no pull to time, there's no pull to space, we might call that absolute rest. So one way to describe the absolute now, at a small time-space scale, using now time-space in the relative sense, one way to describe it at a small scale is there's a cycle. There's absolute rest, and then that absolute rest breaks apart. We could call the absolute rest zero because it's not polarized into anything that's affirmative or negative. That's the answer to the koan, does the dog have a Buddha nature? If you answer no, that's a correct answer. But you have to understand that that no, N-O, is not the no of yes versus no. That's the big capital no. Inevitably, that absolute rest, that singularity, that spiritual black hole, in the good sense of black hole, the source, inevitably, it breaks apart because it's unstable. It isn't a thing. It's what happens when all the yeses and all the nos, the relatives yeses and nos, all the affirmation and negation, needed to mold this or any conceivable universe, when all the binary polarities simultaneously cancel out. So zero is actually just all the positives and negatives, when they come together, they give you 0. So in a sense, it's very rich. It contains everything, but it's not a thing. And because of that fundamental instability, it breaks apart. When it breaks apart, half of it only knows to expand. Half of it only knows to contract. They do their thing. If you stay with that, then you are that. You're that alternating cycle of absolute activity, absolute rest. Absolute activity, absolute rest. So life on this planet is a cycle. Relative activity, relative rest. Or no, that's not the way to put it. I take that back. Frenetic activity during the day and fitful rest during the night is the cycle of this planet for many people. So in a sense, it's a similar cycle, but instead of being driven activity and fitful, or frenetic activity and fitful rest, it's effortless activity and absolute, profound, big stop rest. So you experience that cycle. That's one way to describe what it's like when you touch consciousness directly. So then, if that's what the source tastes like, then what does the surface taste like? Well, the surface tastes like whatever. Inner and outer, see, hear, feel. That surface is like so much foam that's born in the cleft between expansion and contraction. Like when you there's this very expensive property in this part of California. If you're on the ocean, it costs a lot of money, right? To have like a house that's right overlooking the Pacific. Why is it that people are willing to pay so much money for that kind of property? Well, one interpretation is so that you can just look out your back window anytime you want, or your front window, depending, and you can see the source by watching the waves. When the wave comes in, you'll see that it's simultaneous expansion and contraction. The surface of the wave is moving towards the land, but there's an undertow that's pulling it out towards the center of the ocean at the same time. And when the wave breaks, you have the famous hokusai, the waves at Kanagawa, that famous ukiyo-e print, Japanese woodblock print. So you have this hokusai wave. The crest breaks. The part that is expanding separates from the part that's contracting, and they create a gap with a bunch of foam and a lot of noise. And then at some point, you notice the force that's moving towards the shore stops. The force that's pulling back stops, and there's a cessation. All the foam and all the noise goes away, and then the cycle starts again. How is it that T.S. Eliot put it? Not seen because not looked for, but heard, half heard, in the stillness between two waves of the sea. And all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. Okay, that's absolute rest. And then the cycle starts again. Polarization, neutralization. And you're aware both of the undercurrent, or of both of the ocean of consciousness, but you're also aware of the foam and the noise. But it's just foam and noise. It's just an epiphenomenon. The foam and the noise are the inner and outer scenery of the senses. So that you can't see, you cannot contact the world through sight, sound, touch, or contact the world through image, talk, body, emotion. You can't contact the world or contact your own personal identity without first contacting that which links everything together. And that is the first touching of the heart. And then from that, there will be automatically, whether you want it or not, a sense of love, just like the little child. Like Jesus said, lest ye become as little children, you cannot enter the kingdom. So this is going back to what it was like, if you can remember, in the very early part of life, the first few months of life. Now, it's true sometimes, the neonate is upset and crying and uncomfortable, but not always, okay? And when it's not upset or crying or uncomfortable, where is it? What is it experiencing? In recent years, I've started to remember, vividly remember my earliest experiences. And they were absolutely the experience of simultaneous expansion and contraction when I was okay as a little infant. And at maybe around the age of 2 or 3 or 4, 5, 6, somewhere, I'm not quite sure exactly where, but I can remember that going away and something replacing it. And I actually remember thinking, something's wrong. Something's wrong. What happened? Everything was okay. And now I'm worrying, and I'm afraid, and I'm always thinking about everything. And I'm never really happy for no reason now. I can remember losing the kingdom of heaven. That I've actually remembered all my life, but what I didn't remember was specifically what the kingdom of heaven felt like. Of course, because I'd lost it. After many decades of practice, oh yeah, that's what it was. Now I remember. And fortunately, I encountered this practice that allows me to go back and sort of do it again, but this time do it right. Or another way to put it is be in the enviable position of having your cake and eating it too. Meaning, when everything's fine for the infant, they're in this primordial perfection, but they don't know how to negotiate the world, so they're likely to hurt themselves or do something inappropriate. So you go through these life experiences, good news, bad news. Good news, you become adult, you know not to touch fire or, run out into the street or what have you. You know how to negotiate the world as an adult. Bad news, you lost the primordial perfection. Having your cake and eating it too is the best of both worlds. You're a competent adult that can act effectively in the world. And yet while you're doing that, actually literally while you're doing that, you don't lose contact with this primordial perfection. So if you touch the heart that way, in other words, touch the nature of consciousness, then your heart will be touched, because it seems, in the emotional sense, because it seems like you're always looking at yourself. And that's a very emotional experience. If the self that you're looking at is a garbage can, or let's say, somewhat more melodramatically, a human being that smells to you like a garbage can because of the way they act, you do experience oneness first. You do experience unconditional love next. But if you need to take an action to correct that person, well, that action is going to be more effective if you've touched the heart in the two ways that I just described before the action. And touching the heart in the two ways that I just described takes a fraction of a second. In fact, it's always there, whether you notice it or not. So the effect of that on how one acts in the world, the decisions one makes, the actions, the words that one speaks, the effect of touching the heart in two ways is, with time, to make us much more effective in the world. That's the phrase I like to use. And that could be described as a balanced practice. So we can speak of what I just described as the deepest, as one way to talk about the taste of consciousness at the deepest level. One way to talk about it. However, we don't have to use the phrase deep. I like that phrase, it comes natural. However, it is a spatial metaphor of going down. And in fact, that's quite a good metaphor for the process. We can describe this path as a kind of journey from surface to source. We don't really turn away from the senses, we sort of turn at right angles and auger down into consciousness. So between surface and source, some people encounter unusual phenomena, other people don't. But certainly one way to think about it is, well, we're augering down into the center of consciousness. It's like a sphere. However, in other traditions, Western traditions, it's thought of as going up because God's in heaven. So we are sort of transcending this low earth existence, and we find this spiritual thing that's considered to be above. Now, it's fine if you want to think of it as ascending to Shalom Bimromav, the peace of God's own heaven. You can think of it that way. St. John of the Cross talked about Subida del Monte Carmelo, the ascent of Mount Carmel. So that's a sort of going up. But he did say when he drew the picture of climbing Mount Carmel, he actually drew it like, a picture of it. It's been preserved. And written on this picture is nada, 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 nada. That every place along the journey up is nothing, nothing, nothing. And then at the very top, he has y en monte nada. And when you finally reach the peak, that's the nothing, because it's not a thing. It's either absolute rest outside of time and space, or it's absolute activity that is the cleft that we call time and space, within which self and world arise and are reabsorbed, arise and are reabsorbed over and over again. So if you want to think of it as going down, you can. If you want to think of it as going up, you could think of it that way. However, the more scientific and somewhat prosaic way to describe it, and if I wasn't being allowed to talk poetry and be metaphorical, if I was constrained to speak to a group of scientists, which I often am, I wouldn't use this language at all. I would not talk about deep or high. I would talk about just before. I would use temporal language. And that is not metaphor, that's not poetry, that's actually physical science. Here's what I mean. There's a standard test that is done for newborn children, where they test the auditory system of the child. And the way that they do this is through what's called brainstem auditory evoked potential. So brainstem means what it sounds like, really deep down in your brain. Evoked potential, well, a sound will evoke a voltage change in a processing center in the brain. And a sight will do the same. Any kind of sensory event creates changes in electrical patterns in the brain. And those are typically monitored through voltage. You don't actually look at the electrical field directly. You don't look at the current. You monitor volts, which is called electrical potential. So when you have a sensory experience, inner or outer, it causes a pattern of electrical, or it's associated with a pattern of electrical activity in the brain. And if you monitor that electrical activity in voltage, then the change in voltage that's caused or associated with the sensory experience, that's called an evoked potential. In other words, it's a potential that happens because of something, some experience you're having. So an auditory evoked potential means a voltage change, in this case associated with external hearing. So they'll expose the infant to a sound, and they have electrodes placed so that as the sound is being processed, first the sound strikes the tympanic membrane, the eardrum, and then that causes the inner bones, to move, and then that causes pressure changes in the organ of Corti. And those then create a first voltage in the spiral ganglion. And then there's a next voltage a little further up, which I think is called the trapezoid body, but I could be wrong. And then there's another voltage. I should have reviewed my neuroanatomy before this talk. In one of the let's see, it must be I think the inferior colliculus. Then maybe the next is what's it called? Forgetting the name. It'll come back. And then you have the primary and secondary auditory cortices that are in the temporal lobe. So there's, about at least a half dozen processing stations. And there's only a few milliseconds between, tens of milliseconds. That's a thousandth of a second, right? So literally, it takes a fraction of a second to jump from each of those processing stations. Yeah, pretty sure it was the medial geniculate body. Right. Okay, so I told you I'd remember. So each one of those is a processing station, and you can actually track it physically in time. And if the infant has a problem, you can actually tell exactly where the problem is, where neurologically there's a break in the processing. So over a period of maybe a second or two, from the very first striking of from the very first evoked potential in the spiral ganglion to the final evoked potential on the secondary acoustic cortex. There's these sequences of processing. And this isn't just true for hear out. It is presumably true for all sensory experience. So as your detection skills increase with time, you're actually sort of able to hear. Maybe you go from I don't think it's literally this, but something like first you only consciously hear on the secondary auditory cortex, and then you start to hear what the primary hears, which you never heard before, except it's a little different from sound, but it's obviously sound. And then maybe you're able to hear into the geniculate body, and then you're able to hear into the what did I call it? The colliculus, and then into the trapezoid body. And then finally, maybe you can actually hear in the ear itself. Except by that time, it's no longer sound. It's the origin of sound, which is the origin of visual and auditory in you and in all other sentient beings, in everything. At some point, you hear back to the unstruck sound, the anahata shabda in Sanskrit. Also, that's from South Asia, from East Asia, exactly the same concept. Sekishu no onjo, the sound of one hand. There's no clapping, that's the English version. The Japanese version and Chinese version is one hand sound. zhisho, insheng in Mandarin, Japanese sekishu no onjo. So you hear the unstruck sound, you see the unilluminated sight, you feel the incorporality of the corpus. And what do you see, hear, feel? This alternating cycle of absolute activity, absolute rest. So you're able to simultaneously tune into what is temporally the earliest that connects you to everything. You touch consciousness, you touch the heart. But you're also able to tune into all the other stations, including the surface. And on the surface, you experience love for no reason other than the all reason. And then you do what you need to do in the world. As human beings develop the ability to do that, and I do suspect that if we survive, we will, as a species, develop the ability to do that. I think we are the early adapters, or early adopters, I guess that's the phrase. Also early adapters, actually, historically. We're the early adopters. I suspect if there is a future for us, this is going to be a major feature of the future. So, absolute rest breaks apart into absolute activity and then returns. On small time-space scales, that's what it's like. It's cyclic. Absolute rest, absolute activity, and then the relative experiences born in between. However, at large time-space experiential scales, it's always simultaneous expansion and contraction. It's an eternal fountain. Que bien sea la fonte que mana y corre, aunque es de noche. How well I know that fountain that gushes and flows, although by night, because of course you're in the formless. It's in the emptiness, it's the activity of emptiness. So you could, St. John of the Cross, who said those words in Spanish in the 16th century, this is what he was referring to. So there's this eternal fountain that for everyone is constantly gushing and gathering and giving birth to and reabsorbing the inner and outer scenery. And to the extent to which this is a reality for you, to that extent you know, oh, this is what I am at the deepest level. This is what everyone is at the deepest level. This is the heart of the matter. And therefore, to the extent to which that's a reality for a person, to that extent, the horrors of old age, sickness, and death are much less troubling to one. Because this deeper identity is eternal. It's ironic. The non-thing that is a doing of impermanence, it's permanent. And to the extent to which you have this figure ground reversal, instead of being the product of this activity, you can, to a certain extent, say, I am that activity itself. The extent to which one can say that, to that extent, one's own frailty, physical frailty, mortality, and so forth, well, you can somewhat sidestep that. You have this place to go to. So, to touch the heart in the sense of liberation, and then to touch the heart in the sense of a call to loving service and effective action, pretty much sums up why we came here.
Mm-hmm.